They dragged a black woman out of first class for refusing to comply. But here's the truth, they never asked her to comply. They told her to move because she didn't look like someone who should be in seat 1A. For crew members, 2 security guards, dozens of eyes watching her being escorted down the aisle like a criminal. No one questioned it. No one stopped it. Because when you're black, wearing a tailored suit, holding a first-class ticket, and sitting where they don't expect you to be, suddenly you're a threat. She said just one sentence before they pushed her past business class. Are you absolutely sure about this? They weren't. Not even close. Because 37 minutes later, the cabin would receive an urgent directive from corporate command. A name would appear on every crew tablet. A name none of them had cared to check. Hers. And next to it, one word: owner. This isn't a flight story. It's a slow-motion disaster you can't look away from. What begins as public humiliation ends in a brutal reversal of power. Staff suspended on the tarmac. Executives fired before baggage claim. A man who thought he ruled the financial world, reduced to silence, holding a termination letter. And her? She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her revenge was never about rage. It was about revelation. Hit like if that opening stunned you. Subscribe for the full breakdown and tell us in the comments. At what moment did you realize they were messing with the wrong woman? And where in the world are you watching from? Stick around. You haven't seen the real twist yet. It was a bitterly cold December morning at JFK International Airport, the kind where breath turned visible and time moved slower through the fog of holiday traffic. The departure hall buzzed with urgency. Families bundled in scarves, business travelers tapping away at tablets, and harried announcements echoing overhead. Among the bustle, a woman in a tailored black suit wheeled a sleek carry-on past the first-class check-in zone. Her name, Amara Wells. Her posture, calm, confident, unbothered. She wasn't flashy, but there was a certain quiet power about her, shoulders squared, gaze steady, movements deliberate. A well-worn passport peeked from her inner coat pocket, and in her hand, a boarding pass that read, Western Skies Airlines Seat 1A First Class. As she stepped into the reserved first-class check-in lane, the agent at the counter glanced up, hesitated, and stiffened almost imperceptibly. A second passed. Then 2. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to use the economy line to your left, the agent said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Amara stopped, slightly tilting her head. I believe I'm in the right place, she said evenly, handing over the boarding pass without flinching. The agent barely glanced at it. This line is for our premium travelers, she clarified, as though Amara hadn't understood English. I'm aware, Amara replied, her tone neither defensive nor aggressive, just tired. The type of exhaustion that came not from a lack of sleep, but from a lifetime of microaggressions too small to name, but too frequent to ignore. From across the polished floor, a security guard approached. The agent had waved discreetly, signaling for assistance before Amara had even opened her mouth. The man's footsteps echoed louder than necessary, his expression already set in stone. Is there a problem here? He asked, voice clipped. The agent leaned forward, not whispering, but not yelling either. We have a situation. She's insisting she belongs here, but something feels off. Off, Amara repeated quietly, eyebrows raising. The guard turned to her. Can I see your ID and boarding pass, please? Of course, she said, handing both over. He examined them for a full minute, turning the passport around as if expecting to find a counterfeit watermark or smudged ink. Nothing. Everything was valid. She watched his face, waiting for the moment of awkward acknowledgement. But it never came. Instead, he returned the documents and said, next time, approach through the main check-in area. You're causing unnecessary confusion here. Amara didn't respond. She took back her ID, adjusted her collar, and moved forward as instructed, past the stairs, past the judgment, into the lounge area reserved for people who had long been conditioned to expect silk glove treatment. She, apparently, was the exception. Inside the lounge, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of hush that feels like surveillance. She walked with purpose to an empty leather armchair near the corner window. Not 5 minutes later, Another woman entered, blonde, draped in cashmere, dragging a Louis Vuitton suitcase. The receptionist beamed. "Welcome back, Mrs. Chandler. Espresso or tea today?" "Oh, you know me. Champagne if it's before noon," she laughed. "No ID check. No boarding pass verification. Just recognition and comfort." Amara crossed her legs, ignoring the burning in her chest. She knew better than to let it show. Across the room, seated alone in a booth with his newspaper neatly folded and shoes polished to a mirror finish, was Ronald Bailey. He didn't recognize her. Not yet. Why would he? To him, she was just another misplaced figure among the elite, a silhouette that didn't fit the expected mold. He looked up from his Financial Times and raised an eyebrow. "Seems like they're letting anyone in here these days," he muttered to the man next to him. The man chuckled, eyes flicking to Amara. "Guess so," he said. The receptionist, now flustered, approached Amara again. "Ma'am, I just want to double check. Are you flying first class on this route?" "Yes," Amara said. She opened her phone, pulled up her ticket confirmation, and held it up. "I'm also a Founders Executive Member with Orion Capital. Is there a problem?" The name Orion made the receptionist blink. Her smile froze. "Oh no, of course not. Just protocol. I'll get you a refreshment." "Don't bother," Amara said flatly, her tone cold now, her patience run dry. She stood up. "I'll wait at the gate." As she left the lounge, Ronald watched her walk away. "Entitlement," he said. "It's spreading like wildfire." At gate 22B, the boarding hadn't started yet. A young man in uniform walked by and gave her a nod, the kind of respectful nod that said he knew exactly who she was. She nodded back, finally letting herself breathe again. The terminal buzzed around her, but for Amara, it was always the same hum. She had built companies, rescued economies, and owned pieces of the very infrastructure these men pretended to control. Yet still, in moments like this, she was just another stranger to be questioned. But this time, she wouldn't stay silent. Amara moved through the terminal with the same calm intensity she had always carried, one cultivated over years in boardrooms where every glance could be a threat and every pause might hide condescension. Gate 22B buzzed with travelers, but few were headed to first class. The distinction was clear: velvet ropes, gold-plated signs, and attendants who measured travelers by shoes, accent, and skin tone. Amara stepped up to the priority boarding lane, ticket in hand. The attendant, a young man barely past 20, took one look and pressed a button. A red light blinked above his scanner. "I'm sorry," he said, voice shifting into tight professionalism. "I'll need to verify something." Amara's brow arched. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" she asked. "Not exactly," he replied. "It's just the system flagged it. Please step aside a moment while I check with my supervisor." Before she could speak, he had already turned away, whispering to a woman at the desk behind him. Their eyes flicked back toward her more than once. Ronald Bailey appeared moments later, escorted ahead of a line by another agent. He gave Amara a passing glance, still no sign of recognition, and offered a sly smirk as he was ushered toward the gate entrance. "Bailey Ronald. Mercer Gate Holdings," he announced, more for the others than for verification. The gate agent beamed. "Of course, Mr. Bailey. Right this way." As he walked by, he said to no one in particular, but loud enough to hear, "Good to see standards haven't fallen too far today." Amara's jaw clenched, but her posture remained still. She'd seen this 100 times in 100 different countries, the instinct to gatekeep spaces not by merit or ticket class, but by assumptions stitched into the fabric of bias. The supervisor returned with a clipboard and an artificial smile. "Ma'am," she began, "we've confirmed your booking. However, the first-class cabin is operating under adjusted boarding protocols today. We'll call you shortly." "Adjusted?" Amara asked. "What does that mean?" The supervisor didn't flinch. "Just boarding by strategic tiers. Your seat remains the same." Amara glanced past her toward the gate. White men in suits and polished watches were already disappearing down the jet bridge. She stepped aside, knowing the pattern. Delay, deflect, deny. Minutes passed. Then 15. A family of 4, white, loud and unbothered, was waved through the first-class lane with ease. Another man in jeans and an oversized coat boarded without being questioned. When Amara finally approached again, another staff member stopped her. "We're boarding first class now," he said, not recognizing her from before. "Are you lost?" "I've been waiting," Amara replied, her tone sharp enough to pierce steel. She held up her ticket again. This time, the agent scanned it quickly and blinked. "Oh," he murmured, clearly confused. "You're 1A. The highest tier seat. The one usually reserved for board directors and celebrities." He motioned for her to continue. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a silent, reluctant clearance. As she walked down the jet bridge, the air grew colder. Not in temperature, but in tone. A flight attendant at the door greeted the passenger ahead of her with a wide smile and warm welcome. When it came to Amara, the smile flattened, the voice dimmed. "Welcome aboard," she said, handing her a printed card. "Please take seat 6D, rear first class." Amara blinked. "I'm assigned to 1A, she said. The attendant checked again. "There was a seating adjustment made at the gate," she replied coolly. 6D is still first class, technically." Amara stared at her, her voice a calm, lethal whisper. "Technically," she repeated. "Would you like me to return to the gate and ask why I was reassigned?" The attendant hesitated. "If you'd prefer to deplane and check with the desk, we can hold the aircraft for a few minutes." Amara knew the trap. Leave the plane and risk being marked as a disturbance, as non-compliant. Stay on board and accept the quiet insult. She inhaled deeply and moved toward 6D. The seat was narrow, adjacent to the galley where carts banged and footsteps clattered. This was not the first class she'd paid for. This was the message. As she stowed her carry-on, a passenger in 2A leaned across the aisle, whispering, "They tried that with my assistant once." She sued. 1. Quiet settlement. He winked. "You should look into that." Amara didn't respond. She adjusted her coat and sat. In silence. The hum of injustice pressed against her ears like cabin pressure before ascent. Moments later, Ronald Bailey passed by on his way to seat 1C. He looked down, paused, and offered a bemused smirk. "Quite the upgrade, isn't it?" he said. "They must be loosening the dress code these days." He chuckled and kept walking. Amara said nothing. She didn't flinch. But inside, something sharp twisted. Not rage, not shame. Precision. Calculation. She opened her phone. No texts. No emails. Just a silent to-do list, pre-saved for contingencies like this one. She'd seen this before, when perception collided with prejudice and power tried to hide behind policy. What they didn't know was that she didn't need a title to have authority. She didn't need a badge to have reach. And soon, every person who had stared, doubted, and dismissed her would come to learn one thing the hard way. Amara Wells never forgot, and she never let it slide. Amara remained seated in 6D, her posture controlled, her breathing steady, but her eyes never still. They scanned the cabin slowly, deliberately, not out of curiosity, but out of preparation. She had learned long ago that silence was more dangerous than noise. It was the silence of complicity, the silence of people watching, judging, but never intervening. The first-class cabin was a pristine showcase of opulence. Warm cream leather seats, gold-trimmed fixtures, glass partitions, and handcrafted amenity kits placed neatly on every seat. But all the shine in the world couldn't mask the undertone of discomfort that radiated as more passengers began to notice her presence. A woman across the aisle, wrapped in designer fur, shifted uncomfortably in her seat as if the mere proximity of Amara disrupted her sense of balance. She leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind a manicured hand. He didn't whisper back. He chuckled loudly and nodded in exaggerated agreement. Behind them, a man in his 50s with a Rolex peeking from beneath his sleeve tapped the armrest call button. A flight attendant approached with a practiced smile, but he waved her in closer and muttered, "Are we screening first class properly these days? Just feels like the experience is changing." The attendant, a tall blonde named Lauren, nodded solemnly. "We're reviewing the manifests constantly. But thank you for pointing it out, sir." She turned slightly and cast a glance toward Amara that was neither apologetic nor concerned, only clinical. Ronald Bailey, seated comfortably in 1C, leaned back with a glass of bourbon in hand. His gaze drifted lazily over the cabin until it landed on Amara once again. "Is it just me," he said to the man beside him, "or is the exclusivity of this airline slipping?" The man shrugged, not wanting to be caught agreeing, but not brave enough to refute him either. Ronald sipped and added, "Call me old-fashioned, but I remember when first class meant first class. Now it feels like a social experiment." Amara heard every word. She didn't move. She didn't blink. But inside, her resolve calcified. A young flight attendant walked past, offering newspapers to passengers. When she reached Amara, she paused briefly and then continued walking as if she hadn't seen her. Moments later, she returned, now with drinks. She handed out champagne flutes and cocktails, but skipped row 6 entirely. Amara raised a brow, but said nothing. When the same attendant passed again, Amara calmly raised a finger. "Excuse me," she said. The attendant stopped, blinked, and forced a tight smile. "Yes." Amara pointed to the cart. "May I have a glass of water?" The attendant's smile faded slightly. "Of course," she said, reaching for a plastic bottle and a disposable cup. "No ice. No lemon. No glassware." She handed it to Amara without eye contact and disappeared again. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was slow, steady, intentional. A series of slights, a collection of signals that added up to one message. "You don't belong here." The couple in 2A and 2B laughed over something on their tablet, and the woman glanced at Amara with a smirk. "I hope the airline starts offering loyalty points for patients," she quipped, nudging her husband, "because mine is wearing thin." He chuckled and replied, "Let's hope they don't start letting in people with fake memberships." Amara turned her head slowly toward them. The smile she offered was thin and sharp. "I'm not sure patience is the virtue you should be worried about losing," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm, her words landing like glass against marble. They didn't reply. As the cabin settled and flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Lauren, the lead attendant, made her way back to Amara's row. "Ma'am," she began, voice laced with condescension, "I understand you had concerns about your seating assignment earlier. I want to remind you that first-class service varies slightly depending on the fare category." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Yes," Lauren continued. "Some upgrades are processed automatically. And while we respect all our customers, there are tiers within our service. If something feels off, it's only because different guests receive different levels of attention." "That's an interesting way of saying discrimination," Amara replied. Lauren's expression hardened. "That's not what I said. But that's what you meant," Amara answered calmly. "And I'm fluent in subtext." Lauren stood silent for a moment, then turned and walked away, her pace faster than before. A few minutes later, another attendant offered hot towels to every passenger in the forward cabin. When she reached 6D, she pretended not to notice Amara, turned, and walked away. A man seated behind her leaned forward and whispered, "I complain, but I'm guessing they'd say it was your fault." Amara turned to face him, her tone as level as ever. "It's only my fault if I stay quiet." The man blinked, unsure how to respond. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, the captain made his usual announcements. Everyone buckled in. But in 6D, Amara sat more upright than before. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small, unmarked black case, and quietly removed a tablet. She didn't open an app. She didn't need to. She typed one message, just a few words, "Initiate protocol tier 1." Then she locked the screen and set aside. Whatever was coming had already begun. The plane had lifted off with the smooth grace expected of an international carrier. But inside the first-class cabin, the air had turned thick with unspoken tension. Amara sat in 6D, staring forward, posture composed but sharpened by intent. The gentle ding of the seatbelt sign turning off did little to ease the weight pressing against her chest. Not fear, not anxiety, but precision, coiled and ready. She reached into the seat back pocket, pulled out the airline's amenities brochure, and flipped through it idly, not to read, but to observe. Across from her, a middle-aged man in 6C, who had previously ignored her, now seemed emboldened by the flight's rhythm. He leaned over the armrest, flashing a smirk that didn't touch his eyes. You know, they don't usually assign 1A to last-minute bookings. Guess you really lucked out. His words hung in the air, just long enough to sting without needing elaboration. Amara glanced at him, lips curving into a slight smile. Some people build their luck, she said. Others inherit it and think it makes them superior. The man leaned back, face twitching but silent. Further forward, Ronald Bailey removed his leather shoes and crossed his legs, sipping from a second glass of bourbon. He eyed Amara occasionally, his glances no longer merely curious, but evaluative, calculating. To him, she was a variable that didn't add up, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His experience in finance had taught him that anomalies were either threats or opportunities, and he hadn't yet decided which she was. Meanwhile, the cabin crew began meal service, starting with the forward rows. Lauren, the lead flight attendant, made her rounds gracefully, presenting each course like it was an art exhibit. Her voice was warm, flirtatious, even playful with certain passengers. But when she reached Amara's row, her demeanor chilled like a sudden draft. "I'm sorry," Lauren said crisply. "We've had to reallocate meals based on confirmed fare class. Your selection may be limited." She didn't ask Amara what she wanted. She simply set down a tray, plastic utensils, a pre-packaged entree, and a lukewarm roll. No wine pairing, no linen. Amara looked at the tray, then at Lauren. "And what exactly was my confirmed fare class?" she asked, voice still even. Lauren didn't blink. "Complimentary upgrade from business," she said, tone dry. "It happens sometimes. Nothing to be ashamed of." The words were delivered with surgical precision. Amara leaned slightly forward, meeting Lauren's eyes. "I paid for this seat. Full fare. One way." Lauren's lips twitched slightly, caught between maintaining superiority and acknowledging a potential error. "Then you want to take that up with guest services when we land," she said and walked away. Amara didn't touch the food. She didn't need to eat. Hunger was the last thing on her mind. She stared ahead, watching the reflection of her own face in the glossy wood panel of the seat in front of her. In the faint outline, she didn't see herself. She saw generations of women who had endured worse, stayed silent longer, and still carried the world on their backs. But she also saw something else, the threshold of enough. A line that had now been crossed. The passenger in 5A turned around suddenly, his voice carrying enough for several rows to hear. "Hey, can someone tell me what kind of service this is? I asked for filet mignon and got whatever this is. Who's managing this flight?" The outburst gave Lauren an excuse to storm down the aisle, irritation written on her face. She passed Amara again, muttering, "We're doing our best. Some passengers expect too much for what they paid." Amara smiled to herself, a bitter, amused breath escaping her lips. She knew exactly what Lauren meant, and exactly who she was talking about. About 20 minutes later, just as Amara had begun to type a note on her tablet, another attendant, a younger woman, brunette, visibly nervous, approached her with a clipboard. "Ma'am," she said softly, "we've received a request from operations to verify seat assignments. There may have been a manifest error." Amara looked up, her voice like a scalpel. "Are you asking me to move again?" The attendant hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder at Lauren, who watched from the galley like a general overseeing a maneuver. "We've been advised to reseat a few passengers for cabin balance," she replied. "Cabin balance," Amara repeated, tasting the absurdity of the phrase. "Let me guess. You need me to go further back." "It's just a temporary adjustment," the attendant offered. "You'll still receive first-class service." Amara nodded slowly. "Tell me which seat." 12E, the attendant said quickly. "It's still under the premium fare category." Amara stared at her for a long, unbroken moment. Then she rose. She didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't protest. She gathered her things, placed her tablet carefully into her case, and walked down the aisle. As she passed Ronald Bailey, their eyes met, his eyes widening just a fraction as if sensing, for the first time, that he had misread something essential. Amara offered no words, no glance back, only motion. Her heels clicked against the carpet like punctuation marks. The passengers in rows 7 through 10 watched in silence as she was led past them, toward the rear bulkhead near the economy galley. Seat 12E wasn't even in first class. It was an aisle seat near the lavatory, narrow, rigid, wedged between two other travelers who didn't look up when she arrived. She placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her and sat, her breath steady, her pulse unmoving. Above her, the soft chime of the call button echoed again, and a voice came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for turbulence. Return to your stations." Amara closed her eyes briefly, and in that darkness, something clicked into place. Not rage, not emotion. Strategy. The reshuffling of power. A recalibration. Something none of them could see coming. Something she had already begun writing 3 hours ago. The seat in 12E was stiff, its cushions worn thinner than they appeared, and its proximity to the rear galley meant Amara could hear every clang of trays, every slosh of half-filled water pitchers, and every casual remark exchanged between crew members who seemed to have already forgotten she was within earshot. Or perhaps they hadn't. Perhaps the comments were made precisely because they knew she was there, boxed into this narrow shell of a seat, surrounded not by luxury, but by intentional isolation. The passenger in 12D, a middle-aged man wearing noise-canceling headphones and an oversized sports jacket, kept bumping her elbow with each movement, never once offering an apology. On her other side, a woman who reeked faintly of stale perfume and entitlement kept glancing toward her with something between disdain and suspicion. Amara didn't look back. She folded her coat neatly, placed her hands in her lap, and stared at the safety instructions card in front of her, as if it contained a secret code only she could decipher. She could feel the pressure building, not just in the cabin, but inside herself. Every breath she took felt like swallowing the weight of centuries of inherited patience. She wasn't unfamiliar with discomfort. What unsettled her now wasn't the treatment, it was the choreography of cruelty. This was coordinated, calculated, disguised as procedure, but designed to degrade. No single act was catastrophic on its own, but together, they formed a symphony of dismissal. Roughly 20 minutes into the flight, a male flight attendant named Jeff approached from front. He was taller than most of the crew, with a slicked-back hairstyle and a permanent look of being slightly unimpressed. "Miss," he said, voice clipped, "we're conducting a routine baggage recheck due to a mismatch in the cargo manifest. I need you to open your carry-on for inspection." Amara looked up slowly. "Are you asking everyone to do this?" Jeff didn't blink. "Just a few passengers. Random selection." "Of course," she said evenly, bending to retrieve her bag from beneath the seat. She unzipped it, revealing a laptop, a leather notebook, a small velvet pouch, and a paperback novel. Jeff scanned the contents without touching them, then glanced at her ID tag, still clipped to the inner flap. "What do you do?" he asked abruptly. "Excuse me," she replied, professionally. "What's your job?" His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory, as if he were trying to catch her in a lie. "I invest in futures," she answered, offering the faintest smile. "Do you?" Jeff muttered something under his breath, something inaudible, but unmistakably dismissive, then turned and left without acknowledging her further. Behind him, a crew member in the galley muttered, "Maybe she's some kind of assistant, or trying to look the part." The curtains swished shut again. As the beverage cart made its way down the aisle, passengers shifted and perked up, ready for refreshments. When it reached her row, the attendant barely slowed. "We're out of red wine," she said flatly, though the rose before had clearly been served. "Still water or nothing." Amara didn't answer. The woman pushed the cart onward, muttering again. Minutes later, a man, easily in his late 60s, graying hair, expensive shoes, rose from his seat in 11C, turned around, and peered down at Amara. "Do you mind switching seats?" he asked without preamble. "I prefer aisle." Amara raised an eyebrow. "This is an aisle seat." "Yes," he said, "but mine is closer to the lavatory. You might be more comfortable there." The implication was razor-sharp and intentional. "No," Amara said coolly. "I'm comfortable here." The man frowned, clearly annoyed that the passive pressure didn't work. "It's just a suggestion," he muttered and returned to his seat, louder than necessary, as if narrating to the cabin. The moments ticked by, heavy and slow. Another announcement came over the intercom. "We'll be experiencing light turbulence over the North Atlantic. Please remain seated." The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the economy cabin. In the dimness, Amara reached into her notebook and flipped to a page marked only with a single date and time. December 18th, 1440 Universal Time Coordinated Activation Threshold. Her hand hovered for a second. She didn't touch the page. She didn't need to. Everything she needed to do had already been done. She wasn't reacting to humiliation. She was recording it, internally, strategically, moment by moment, letting each offense stack like bricks in a wall that would eventually fall on top of those who laid it. When the lights came back on, a different crew member, female mid-30s, with a pleasant enough face twisted into polite control, walked by and dropped a folded blanket onto Amara's lap without a word. "We've had reports you look chilled," she said. "We want all our guests to be comfortable." The words were sugar-coated, but the delivery was dry. Amara didn't unfold the blanket. She placed it on the empty tray table and kept her eyes forward. Suddenly, a loud voice from the front rang out. "Excuse me, there's someone sitting in my seat." The cabin tensed. An elderly woman, sharply dressed, marched down the aisle, pointing toward the back. "I was supposed to be in 12E, she declared. Everyone turned. Jeff returned, brows furrowed, whispering rapidly to the woman before stepping toward Amara. "Ma'am," he said, "there's been a mistake. That seat was double booked." "This seat?" Amara asked calmly. "Yes," Jeff said. "I'll need to reseat you once more. It's just temporary, I promise." She exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then gathered her things again. "Where now?" "Seat 27B, he said, still within premium access. He didn't blink as he said it. The number echoed. 27B, 5 rows from the tail. No curtain, no class divider. A row with no extra legroom, nestled directly beside the galley garbage bins. The downgrade wasn't accidental. It was retribution dressed as logistics. Amara stood, steady, controlled, her voice no louder than necessary. "Lead the way." As she followed him down the aisle, again, she noticed passengers whispering now, no longer hiding their eyes. They had seen the shift. They had felt it. But still, they said nothing. Ronald Bailey watched from his place in 1C, his glass half full, his stare lingering. Something behind his eyes had shifted, barely perceptible, but there, a seed of doubt, a whisper of recognition, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd miscalculated something far more important than cabin status. But that thought didn't yet reach the surface, not before one last voice pierced the quiet. A younger passenger, maybe late 20s, leaned into the aisle just as Amara passed, then called out with a smirk, "Hey, you forgot your attitude up front." There were a few snickers. Amara didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. She moved forward, heels clicking, shoulders straight, expression unreadable, carrying with her not humiliation, but a silence so sharp it made the back of the plane feel suddenly colder. She reached 27B, placed her bag down gently, and lowered herself into the seat, glancing briefly at the emergency procedures guide before tucking it back into the seat pocket. Her hands rested on her lap. Her breathing remained calm. And somewhere far above the clouds, while the aircraft soared steadily east across the Atlantic, a message was quietly being delivered. Seat 27B was colder than the rest of the cabin, not because of faulty air conditioning, but because it had been intentionally neglected. The panel light above her seat flickered with a faint, irregular buzz. The tray table wobbled at the hinge, and the passenger in 27A, a man slouched in a hoodie, visibly irritated by her presence, let out a long, audible sigh as she settled in beside him. Amara didn't flinch. Her mind was no longer registering insults as isolated blows, but as part of an orchestrated movement, a dance choreographed by power clinging to its illusion of superiority. She had seen this dance before on different stages, in boardrooms, on trading floors, in Ivy League lounges. The same script, different costumes. From the moment she entered this plane, the script had unfolded with clockwork precision. The only difference now was that she had stopped pretending not to notice. She was watching every beat of the performance, and she knew exactly how it would end, just not when. The flight attendants had thinned out in this section of the aircraft, their frequency of movement reduced to a trickle. The passengers in rows 25 through 30 were treated with quiet detachment, but Amara's presence drew a unique flavor of disdain. No one offered her a pillow. No one offered to take her coat. No one offered her eye contact. When the beverage cart reached her row again, this time pushed by Jeff himself, he slowed almost reluctantly. "We've got ginger ale, tonic, or water," he said flatly. "No juice, no coffee." "Water's fine," Amara replied, her tone neutral. He handed her a sealed plastic cup without saying another word, then moved past her with a speed that barely hid his eagerness to be gone. The man in 27C, a wiry, sunburned traveler in his mid-50s, turned toward her and muttered, "You must have really messed something up to get moved back here. They don't just throw first class down here for fun." Amara turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him. "Maybe they do when someone makes them uncomfortable just by existing," she said. He chuckled, but looked away. The kind of laugh that wasn't born of humor, but of not knowing what else to say. He reached into the seat pocket for a magazine, avoiding her gaze. At that moment, turbulence hit, mild, but enough to make cups rattle. The captain's voice echoed overhead, calm and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're hitting a light pocket of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The flight attendants moved to secure loose items, but Lauren appeared again in the forward cabin. She didn't come to check on Amara. She walked briskly down the aisle, paused at row 27, and leaned in toward Jeff, whispering something as she tilted her head slightly toward Amara. Jeff nodded, and within seconds he pulled out a small document pouch and crouched down beside her seat. "Miss Wells," he said quietly, but not kindly, "due to concerns raised by crew and passengers, we need to verify your identification one more time. Please present a form of ID." Amara's eyes narrowed. "You've already seen my boarding pass." "Twice." Jeff shrugged. "It's policy now. Please cooperate." She reached into her coat and retrieved her ID, sliding it into his waiting hand. He looked at it longer than necessary, holding it close to his face, then flipping it over as if expecting to find a forgery mark. After a long, deliberate pause, he handed it back with no apology. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said and walked away. The man in 27C snorted under his breath. "We're safer already." Amara closed her eyes for a long moment. Not to rest, to contain, to file away every word, every tone, every slight. She had trained herself to remember conversations verbatim. It was how she had survived Wall Street, Congress, Davos. And now it would be how she dismantled this. 15 minutes later, a pair of children ran screaming down the aisle from row 18. They weaved between passengers, bumping elbows, pulling open tray tables. A flight attendant gave a weak, "Please return to your seats," but didn't enforce it. As the kids passed Amara's row, one of them knocked her water cup into her lap. The chill soaked through her slacks instantly. "Hey," she called calmly, raising a hand. Jeff turned around. "Is there a problem?" She gestured at her soaked pants. "A child just ran into me and spilled my drink. I'd appreciate a towel or something to clean up." Jeff looked unimpressed. "Accidents happen," he said. "We're not responsible for passenger-on-passenger incidents." "I didn't ask you to be responsible," she replied. "I asked for a towel." Jeff rolled his eyes and disappeared into the galley. 5 minutes later, he returned with a napkin, singular, and dropped it wordlessly onto her tray table. Across the aisle, a young man stared openly at her. "Is this your first time flying?" he asked, smirking. "Because you're not doing a great job blending in." His voice was loud enough for others to hear, and a few passengers chuckled. Amara didn't answer. She simply turned back toward the window, her reflection catching in the darkness of the glass. Behind her eyes, a different flight was underway, one no one around her could see, one where the turbulence would be measured not in sudden dips, but in broken reputations. The pilot's voice returned again, announcing a change in airspeed and a slight adjustment to their arrival time. Amara reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny, matte black device no larger than a thumb drive. She inserted it into her tablet. No one noticed. The screen flickered, then displayed a screen with 3 words at the center. AUTH access granted. She tapped a single icon, nothing flashy, no audible alert. Just a green light that pulsed once, and then faded into black. She closed the tablet and placed it back in her bag. The man in 27C glanced over at her again. "What's that? Secret agent stuff?" he said with a half laugh. She smiled faintly, not answering. He didn't need to know. None of them did. Not yet. A call light dinged from 3 rows up. A baby cried somewhere closer to the middle of the cabin. The usual rhythms of long-haul travel resumed. But Amara's world had shifted. She was no longer on a flight to Zurich. She was piloting something else entirely. Something that had been set in motion the moment she walked into that terminal hours ago. When someone decided that she didn't belong in the space she had paid for. When they chose not just to relocate her physically, but to strip her of dignity piece by piece, under the guise of professionalism. She adjusted her seat slightly, and her knees pressed against the seat in front of her. Another reminder of just how far she'd been pushed back. But her mind wasn't in 27B. It was elsewhere, focused, awake. And then a voice crackled over the plane's internal line. Not a passenger's, not a crew member's, not even the captain's. It was calm, clear, and entirely unexpected. It said only one thing. The voice came through the overhead speaker with no preamble, no chime, and no warning. It was not the flight attendant's polished tone or the captain's usual cadence. It was deeper, calmer, and wrapped in a confidence that immediately silenced the ambient noise in the cabin. "Good evening, passengers," it began, the enunciation precise and eerily composed. "This is a special in-flight operational notice to all cabin crew and senior flight staff. A re-verification of executive-level passenger credentials is underway. Please remain at your posts and await instruction." There was a pause, followed by a tone that was not part of any routine flight announcement. Low, deliberate, and coded. It wasn't designed for the passengers. It was a signal for the crew. A directive from above them in more ways than one. Amara sat motionless in 27B, her face unreadable, her fingers resting lightly on her armrest. Only the slow expansion of her chest revealed that she was breathing differently now. Slower, deeper, more centered. Lauren, up in the forward cabin, had frozen in place as soon as the voice started. Her eyes darted to Jeff, who stood near the galley, mouth half open. The intercom line clicked off, but the silence it left behind hummed louder than any turbulence. The business class passengers had begun glancing around, uncertain whether to be concerned or curious. Ronald Bailey stirred in 1C, raising an eyebrow, slowly lowering the newspaper he had barely been pretending to read. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. The man beside him, a regional banker from Munich, whispered. "Never heard that on a commercial flight before. Sounds corporate." Bailey nodded, unsettled. Something didn't feel right, not dangerous, but disruptive. And Bailey hated disruptions. They cost money, they broke rhythm, and most importantly, they made men like him feel briefly powerless. In the rear cabin, Amara remained a statue. The tone, the script, the exact phrasing, they were hers. She had written them, revised them, approved them. She had created the very protocol being activated now. Tier 1, Executive Override. Not used in public flights unless a major breach had occurred, fraud, legal action, or catastrophic customer failure. Or, in this case, willful, systemic humiliation. She hadn't planned to invoke it during this trip. It was her last card. But now, they had played enough hands for her to know this game wasn't going to end with quiet. There needed to be a turn, a pause, a forced reckoning. Back up front, a chime suddenly echoed across the cockpit channel. The captain's voice, now clearly tense, clicked through. Ladies and gentlemen, that previous announcement was unexpected. We're contacting our operations team for clarification. In the meantime, please remain seated as we continue our scheduled service to Zurich." His words trembled under the weight of confusion. He wasn't in control anymore. Not really. The chain of command had shifted. Lauren pulled Jeff aside, her voice hushed but frantic. "What the hell is this? Was this from Zurich HQ?" Jeff shook his head, glancing toward the cockpit. "No, not HQ. This is internal. Someone flagged the manifest." That voice wasn't Zurich. "Then who?" she whispered, her face beginning to pale. He didn't answer. A younger attendant who had been working the forward beverage service leaned over and asked, "What's going on?" Neither of them replied. The tension was rippling now, like a wave moving backward through the plane. Then came the second chime. This one not through the speaker, but through the crew's handheld tablets. Simultaneously, every flight staffer's device lit up with a new message. "Confidential. Executive tier. 1 passenger verification in progress. Cross-reference with real-time manifest authentication. Do not alter seating or service assignments. All staff non-compliance will be logged and submitted for internal review." Lauren's hands trembled slightly as she read it. Her eyes flew to the manifest. There, buried beneath layers of automatic scheduling, under a code name known only to 3 departments in the entire airline, was one name she hadn't noticed before. Not because it wasn't there, but because she hadn't thought it mattered. She had dismissed it, overlooked it. She scrolled again, mouth slightly agape. The screen flashed. Wells, A. Orion Executive Access Tier 0 Clearance. Her stomach dropped. In 27B, Amara finally moved. Slowly, purposefully, she reached down and unzipped her coat, not because she was warm, but because she was done hiding. Underneath, her blouse bore a small silver pin, almost imperceptible unless you knew what it was. The Orion insignia, sleek, minimalist, dangerous in its simplicity. The airline's most powerful institutional shareholder. The woman who could authorize the sale of fleets, reassign executive officers, and restructure entire flight routes with a single boardroom vote. And she had been asked to move seats twice, denied service, publicly inspected, reduced to a curiosity, not because she lacked power, but because no one bothered to imagine she had any. Jeff received the message next. He stared at his tablet as if it had personally insulted him. He looked down the aisle toward Amara, then back at Lauren. "This can't be right," he said. "This has to be some system error. No one like that boards from Gate 22. They come through charter terminals." "It's her," Lauren whispered. "It's been her the whole time." Up front, Ronald Bailey watched the flurry of crew movement, the half-heard murmurs, the sudden clatter of changed rhythms. Something inside him twitched, an old instinct from years of deal-making and power brokering. The kind of instinct that screamed when someone in the room held more cards than they let on. He looked over his shoulder toward the middle of the plane and caught the faint glint of something metallic. A pin, a mark, an identity he hadn't registered before. He leaned forward, then back again. "Impossible," he said under his breath. That seat, that row, but the sinking feeling had already taken hold. A new voice echoed over the intercom. This time a woman's. Calm, professional, but unmistakably high in authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief interruption. Certain adjustments are being made for compliance purposes. Service will resume shortly." The voice wasn't a crew member. It wasn't Zurich operations. It was Amara's liaison at Orion, someone instructed to activate public engagement only in extreme circumstances. The kind that required recalibration of internal respect, not just logistics. The flight attendants began to move again, but this time differently. Stiff, awkward, mechanical. Several of them glanced toward 27B, uncertain whether to approach or avoid. The power dynamic had shifted so hard it snapped. Amara stayed seated, arms crossed loosely, eyes forward, breathing measured. She wasn't waiting for apology. She wasn't waiting for theatrics. She was waiting for compliance. And further up the plane, Ronald Bailey slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, his fingers hesitating, as if he were debating whether to stand up or sink into a seat. His eyes didn't leave her. Not now. Not when he finally realized who she was. Not when it finally hit him that this flight, this experience, was no longer about boarding passes or seat numbers or policy enforcement. It was about perception, about blindness, about what happened when a room full of people decided someone didn't belong based solely on who they thought they were. And in that realization, somewhere deep inside Ronald's pride, something cracked. Ronald Bailey remained frozen in his seat, a hand hovering above the armrest, the other still wrapped loosely around a glass of bourbon that had gone warm from neglect. His eyes locked on the woman in 27B, no longer an anonymous passenger to ignore or deride, but a living contradiction to everything he thought he knew about power, appearance, and entitlement. Around him, murmurs were spreading slowly, as if a collective awakening were creeping down the fuselage. Something had shifted, but no one could name it yet. They could only feel it. A new rhythm had begun playing beneath the surface, one that rattled the confidence of those who had spent decades assuming control belonged only to those who looked like them. Ronald's jaw tensed. He didn't like feeling unprepared. In his world, knowledge was leverage, and leverage was everything. But this woman, this Amara Wells, had been seated 20 rows behind him the entire time, enduring every petty insult, every humiliating maneuver, and not once had she lost her composure. That unsettled him more than any power play on Wall Street ever had. Jeff moved with visible stiffness now, shoulders rigid as he entered the galley and picked up a phone mounted on the wall. He pressed a secure line, the kind rarely used mid-flight unless under direct command. His voice was quiet, but tension rode every syllable. Operations Control, this is Flight 726, crew verification requested. Confirm Tier 0 manifest holder. Passenger Wells, Amara. A voice responded instantly, calm, precise, not to be questioned. Tier 0 confirmed. Full authority granted. Recalibration protocol active. Comply immediately or initiate escalation sequence. Jeff lowered the handset, swallowed hard, and turned toward Lauren. It's real, he said. It's all real. We need to fix this. Lauren didn't answer. Her mind was moving too fast, trying to reverse engineer the last 6 hours and pinpoint the exact moment they had stepped off a cliff and mistaken free fall for control. Further down the cabin, the passengers in surrounding rows had grown quiet, sensing without understanding that the hierarchy was rearranging itself. Flight attendants, no longer performing with rehearsed grace, moved stiffly, consulting their tablets, eyes wide. The system had overruled them. One of them, a younger crew member who had earlier delivered the one-ply napkin, now approached Amara with trembling hands. Miss Wells, she said softly, almost reverently, we've prepared your original seat again. If you'd like to move forward, her voice trailed off like a question, though she hadn't intended to ask one. Amara turned her gaze toward her with a calm detachment of someone who had outgrown vindication. I'll consider it, she replied, her tone so even that it disarmed the attendant entirely. Ronald watched the interaction with an expression that couldn't decide between awe and dread. It was dawning on him now that Amara Wells wasn't just a wealthy woman with influence. She was the woman. The one who had recently been rumored to have acquired a controlling stake in 3 of the largest transatlantic investment consortiums. The one whose company, Orion Holdings, had quietly outbid Mercergate on multiple international contracts, including a pending infrastructure overhaul in Zurich, which, if memory served, involved this very airline's expansion plans. And now she was here, on his flight, in a seat they had tried to deny her, then tried to erase her from entirely. His own pride wrestled with his instinct for survival. A part of him wanted to approach her, apologize, extend a hand in some last-minute act of damage control. But another part of him, the older, stubborn part, still whispered that no one should hold that much power without warning. That people like her were supposed to announce themselves, dress the part, speak the part, play the part, not appear unassuming, and then dismantle everything with silence. Meanwhile, Amara stood. She didn't rush. She didn't grandstand. She simply rose from 27B, gathered her coat, slung her bag over one shoulder, and walked forward. The plane didn't applaud. This wasn't a movie. But the air shifted, just enough that everyone along her path straightened up, sat quieter, looked away. As she passed Ronald's row, she paused. Not for long, just long enough to look him in the eye. "Mr. Bailey," she said, her voice soft but undeniable. "It's been illuminating." Ronald tried to summon a reply, something diplomatic or even self-deprecating, but his mouth betrayed him with silence. Amara gave the slightest nod, then turned and continued her walk. When she reached seat 1A, now empty and perfectly prepared, she didn't sit immediately. She placed her bag in the overhead bin, adjusted the headrest, and then turned to Lauren, who stood nearby with a face drained of color. "I won't need any service for the remainder of the flight," Amara said. "If your team needs time to recalibrate, I'd rather they focus on that." Lauren nodded, unable to form words. She turned and stepped backward as if retreating from royalty, careful not to bump into anything, eyes never meeting Amara's again. Amara finally sat, adjusting her cuffs, folding her coat across her lap. She looked out the window at the expanse of stars beyond the wingtip. The engines hummed steadily, unaware of the drama they carried. Back in row 1C, Ronald sat rigidly, arms crossed tightly, his glass of bourbon untouched. Something in his chest burned, not rage, not embarrassment, but recognition. For the first time in years, he saw the floor beneath him wasn't marble, it was glass. And he had been walking on it for decades, never wondering what might be rising from below. From the cockpit, the captain's voice returned. This time, it was steadier, laced with deference. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Western Skies Airlines, we'd like to acknowledge our distinguished guest on board today. We thank her for her continued support and leadership in advancing the future of global aviation." No name was spoken. None needed to be. Everyone listening already knew who he meant. Somewhere near the center of the plane, a young flight attendant glanced at her fellow crew members and whispered, "We're not keeping our jobs, are we?" The other shook her head slowly. Not after this. But the weight of consequence hadn't even begun to land yet. The plane was still in the air, still crossing the Atlantic. The real fallout would begin on the ground, where job titles would be rescinded, where contracts would be reviewed, where lawsuits would be drafted, and where reputations would be dismantled with the same quiet elegance Amara had wielded from the beginning. Yet in that moment, none of it had started. All that existed was the silence of understanding, the heavy, suffocating silence of people realizing, too late, that they had underestimated the wrong person. And still, there remained one person on this flight who hadn't spoken yet. One whose reckoning had only just begun to take form. As Ronald Bailey shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the voice in his head whispered something he had never dared admit before. The cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss, the cold Zurich air slipping through the threshold like judgment arriving on cue, and Amara Wells remained seated in 1A for a brief moment longer than everyone else, not from hesitation, but from control. She knew what was waiting outside. She had prepared it meticulously. The ground crew stood aligned with unusual posture, for uniformed personnel and 2 members of corporate security, each holding a tablet loaded with documentation and procedural orders. Behind them, a representative from Western Skies Zurich Compliance Office clutched a folder that bore the gold-embossed seal of the company's internal ethics board. As the first-class passengers began to disembark, murmurs rippled through the jet bridge. Something about the presence of executives on the tarmac suggested this was no ordinary arrival. And then it began. Lauren, still trying to mask her composure with professionalism, stepped into the galley with Jeff at her side. "We'll lead the cabin inspection," she whispered, assuming it was about post-flight protocol. But before they could move further, a stern voice from the doorway cut through. Lauren Bridges and Jeffrey Simmons, the man in the gray suit, said, voice sharp as a gavel. "Effective immediately. You are suspended pending formal review under Article 14.3 of the Conduct Code." Jeff blinked. "What?" he asked, voice cracking. "On what grounds?" "Violation of anti-discrimination policy, dereliction of equitable service duty, and breach of Tier 0 compliance protocol. The man replied, "You'll surrender your badges and company devices now." Lauren looked at Amara, still seated, still silent, but something in her expression broke, not from fear, but from the dawning realization that the passenger she had treated like an inconvenience now held the power to dismantle her entire career. Within minutes, 4 more crew members were approached individually and escorted off the aircraft, their earpieces removed, their identification clipped from their uniforms, their eyes darting nervously as passengers tried not to stare. Ronald Bailey watched from behind the curtain with a strange, hollow stillness. The murmurs around him were no longer about Amara. They were about him. He stepped off the plane slowly, expecting nothing and yet dreading everything, and barely made it to the arrival corridor when his own reckoning arrived. A woman in a tailored navy suit stood beneath a Western Skies welcome banner, holding an envelope and flanked by 2 men in legal department attire. "Mr. Bailey," she said with a voice that bore no hint of courtesy, per direction from the executive committee, "please be informed that your consultancy with Western Skies has been terminated, effective immediately." She handed him the envelope. "The termination includes revocation of your global strategy package, withdrawal of all vested stock options, and permanent removal from the European Advisory Council." Ronald stared at her, not blinking, not even angry, just cold, disarmed, deflated. "This is," he started, but she interrupted without emotion. "This is standard protocol, following stakeholder misconduct, involving a Tier 0 executive. Any appeal should be directed through legal channels. Your gate pass has been deactivated." He barely had time to register the statement when his phone buzzed violently in his coat pocket. 3 emails, all from different funds. He opened the first. From Monarch Equity. "Ronald, based on recent developments, we are terminating your advisory status and dissolving your participation in our Zurich expansion project." The second came from Arcturus Holdings. "Please consider this your final notice. Your partnership is concluded. Future communications will route through legal." And the third, from Telion Strategic Fund, was even colder. "We are ceasing all affiliations with Ronald Bailey, effective immediately. Please remove all digital access credentials by end of business." It wasn't just one contract. It was his entire financial structure collapsing in real time. The $18 million in strategy fees and stock valuations were gone before breakfast. His name, once synonymous with security and insight, was now radioactive. He stood in the center of Zurich Airport, not as a man accustomed to deference, but as a cautionary tale unraveling in real time. A camera crew nearby, unrelated, filming a tourism segment, caught the final moments as Ronald lowered his head, trying to avoid the lens. The optics of him, once the Lion of Mercergate, clutching a dismissal envelope while Amara Wells walked past 20 feet away, untouched, greeted by another executive from Orion, was the kind of image that lived in headlines. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The message had already landed. Farther down the concourse, the 6 flight attendants, now stripped of title and authority, sat on a bench near an internal review office, not speaking. One of them clutched a tablet showing a frozen frame of security footage from JFK, the moment Amara had been pulled aside at Gate 22B. Another showed the service record that documented seat adjustment due to nonconformity. The paper trail had always been there. They just never thought anyone would follow it all the way back. Meanwhile, Zurich press staff adjusted their schedules. An internal email had already leaked, listing Amara Wells as the keynote speaker for the Western Skies Stakeholder Summit. She hadn't spoken publicly in nearly a year, but tomorrow she would take the stage not as a consultant or silent investor, but as a voice that decided who would stay in the air and who would be grounded permanently. In a glass meeting room overlooking the arrivals hall, her legal team was already reviewing termination clauses, pulling out files on internal reforms, scheduling executive reshuffles, and drafting statements on behalf of the airline. But for now, Amara herself remained quiet. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't acknowledge the chaos around her. She simply walked toward the exit, surrounded by silence thick enough to drown the city's noise. As Ronald stood, still holding the envelope, he looked around for anyone, to explain how this had all unraveled so quickly. But there was no one. Just voices echoing through the high glass ceilings, a soft announcement about baggage claim, and the weight of a career undone by ego and assumption. His hands shook, and he reached for his phone again, only to realize his access to his Mercer Gate account had already been revoked. The login failed. The server denied him. A subtle, final rejection. Behind him, a janitor passed by slowly, pushing a cart of mops and towels, humming a quiet tune, paying him no attention. The world was moving on, and Ronald Bailey, for the first time in his career, wasn't being followed. He was being left behind, and somewhere in the upper terminal, a familiar voice prepared to speak, not to the press, not to the board, but to someone who had once stood where Ronald stood now, someone who had known the sting of assumption, and chosen to transform it into something no one could ignore. 2 weeks had passed since the Zurich summit, yet the aftershocks of what unfolded aboard Flight 726 still echoed across boardrooms, legal departments, and investor roundtables. Western Skies had initiated a full internal overhaul, starting with a public apology issued on every available platform, print, digital, and live television, acknowledging the discriminatory behavior exhibited by their own staff toward a Tier 0 stakeholder. Their CEO, red-eyed and visibly shaken, had addressed shareholders in a press conference where he stood beside Amara Wells and introduced her not only as the company's largest investor, but also as their newly appointed Chief of Ethical Operations, a position designed specifically for her to lead cultural reformation within the airline. The room had erupted in applause when Amara finally took the stage, not because she had demanded accountability, but because she had chosen grace over destruction. Her voice had been clear, poised, and deliberately restrained. "This is not a revenge story," she had said. "This is a course correction for all of us." Her words echoed across the globe, played on repeat by networks, searching for a redemptive close to a story that had started in silence and humiliation. Meanwhile, Ronald Bailey had disappeared from the public eye, his name scrubbed from advisory panels, his company bio removed, and his legacy left to decay in silence. But what no one expected, what not even Amara had predicted, was what he chose to do next. It began quietly, a foundation registration in upstate New York, then a string of anonymous donations to public education programs, particularly those targeting underserved students of color. Within a month, he re-emerged, not on CNBC or Bloomberg, but on a folding chair in a half-renovated community center in Detroit, where he offered a free lecture on compound interest to a room of teenagers who had never heard the term before. He wore no suit, no tie, no expensive watch, just a pullover sweater, and the kind of weariness that comes from rebuilding a life from the ruins of your own arrogance. Reporters caught wind eventually, but he refused interviews. When asked why he wasn't fighting to clear his name, he replied, "I'm not trying to erase the past. I'm trying to outlive it." He declined keynote invitations. He ignored speculative pieces, wondering whether his remorse was performative. He showed up to class after class, taught students who'd never owned a checking account how to read a credit report, helped single mothers learn how to refinance debt, and partnered with nonprofits to develop digital literacy workshops. For someone who once charged $20,000 per hour for economic insight, he now accepted packed lunches and hand-drawn thank you cards as payment. Some called it penance. Others called it a PR move that got away from him. But those who saw him day after day, scribbling formulas on whiteboards and fielding questions without flinching, saw something else. A man who had finally understood the price of silence. One morning, 6 months later, Amara visited one of these centers unannounced. No press, no security, just her and a dusty rental car. She walked into a room full of young men and women hunched over laptops and worksheets. And there he was, Ronald Bailey, kneeling beside a boy who couldn't have been older than 15, explaining the difference between APR and APY with a whiteboard marker in one hand and a calculator in the other. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't flinch. He stood slowly, wiped his hands on his jeans, and met her halfway across the room. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, not with tension, but with truth. Then Ronald offered a small, tired smile and said, "I was wrong. You knew that before I did, but I needed to say it." Amara studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Words aren't enough," she replied, "but they're a place to begin." She didn't shake his hand. She didn't hug him. She simply turned, addressed the class, and began teaching the second half of the workshop he had started. For the next 2 hours, they co-taught financial fundamentals, as if they had always been doing it, the students hanging onto every word, unaware that just months earlier, one of these instructors had tried to reduce the other to silence. Outside, the sun broke through a slate-gray sky, and inside that modest classroom, a new model of power had taken root, not built on fear, legacy, or dominance, but on humility, growth, and the willingness to transform. When the session ended, and the students filed out one by one, Ronald remained behind, stacking chairs and erasing the board. Amara watched him in silence, then said, "You're not who you were on that plane." He paused, marker in hand, and replied, "Neither are you. Back then, I thought you came to destroy us. But you came to rebuild something better." She nodded. "I came to be seen, to be respected, and to make sure no one else would have to ask for that twice." In the months that followed, the financial world began whispering about the unlikely alliance between the former titan and the woman who had forced his fall. They appeared at education summits, not as icons, but as advocates. They published joint op-eds about ethical leadership, co-founded a scholarship fund for future business students, and quietly became symbols not of scandal, but of transformation. Not everyone forgave Ronald. Not everyone believed he had changed. But Amara never asked anyone to. She only asked that no one forget the lesson. On the 1-year anniversary of the incident aboard Flight 726, Western Skies unveiled a new campaign, "Every Seat, Every Soul." The slogan was printed across terminals, embroidered onto uniforms, and included in every safety video. But more than that, it was written into their policy, because Amara Wells had rewritten the standard, not just for the airline, not just for Ronald, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong based on how they looked, where they came from, or how quietly they chose to carry their strength. And as she stood one morning beside Ronald on the tarmac of a different airport, watching a group of young students board their first ever flight, seats donated by the very airline that once failed her, Amara whispered, "Justice doesn't always come with noise." Ronald nodded, still watching the kids disappear down the jet bridge. "Sometimes," he said, "it arrives with a boarding pass." And in that moment, the silence that had started it all was finally filled, not with revenge, but with redemption. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives that challenge perspectives and spark change. What moment hit you the hardest? Was it the fall, the reckoning, or the redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your take on justice, dignity, and second chances.